I'm going to go through the PowerPoint that I would use in class just because I feel like that's going to be the most beneficial for you guys. And, what I might do is like kind of give you a little heads up and just like as kids come in and we're not up until 3. I'll just give you a heads up, and I might just do this one before so that way anyways. I'm blabbering. Anyway, so here's the properties we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the commutative, the associative, the identity, the inverse, and the distributive. So diving right in, the commutative. So the biggest thing with this one is that we're just going to say that if we take any number, a plus b, it's going to equal b plus a. So sometimes I get confused by letters, so I'd like to actually use numbers because that's a little bit more beneficial for me. So basically what this is saying is this is saying that 3 plus 4 is the same as 4 plus 3. So 3 plus 4, you're just saying to yourself, okay, that's 7. 4 plus 3 is also 7. So that's the commutative property of addition. And the neat thing is the same thing happens with multiplication. So 3 times 4 is going to be the same as 4 times 3. Because 3 times 4 is 12. 4 times 3 is also 12. The same, nothing unique or different there. And so the one that I would do in class for students is just, this is kind of what your homework's going to look like. So it's n plus 3 equals 3 plus, and then here you're just going to put n. So hopefully that makes sense. Same thing here, 7 times q is the same as q times 7. Okay, so the commutative property is that idea of a plus b equals b plus a, and a times b equals b times a. So whatever's on the left and the right is the same. Now, that would be what you would do in class, so I'm going to kind of go through those. Now the next property is what we call the associative property. And this one always has to deal with parentheses. So I sometimes put my little, sorry guys, this is my first video. I guess I haven't done it in a while. But, so here, and the way I think about associative property is like, we always get to choose who we associate with. So in this case, the A and the B are hanging out and kind of C's on the outside, where in this case, A is on the outside and B and C are hanging out. Now, again, if we use numbers, if I do 2 plus 3 plus 4, and then 2 plus 3 plus 4, but over here I have that, and over here I have that, we'll see that 2 plus 3 is 5. Remember, you always do parentheses first. And 5 plus 4 is going to be 9. And then over here, if we do the parentheses first, we get 3 plus 4, which is 7, and 2 plus 7 is also 9. So regardless, as long as you, and remember, it's only with addition. So it's not subtraction, because we don't want to get into that because you won't get the right numbers and stuff like that. So the thing with this, if you have 3, it doesn't matter. You can have like 4 numbers on one side. As long as you do the parentheses first and then add the outside, as long as it's all addition, you're going to get the same answer. Same thing with down here. If in parentheses I have 2 times 3 and then outside I have 4, and I say that that's the same as 2, and in parentheses 3 times 4. 2 times 3 I believe is 6, times 4 is going to give you 24. Where on this side, you do 2 times 12, which is also 24. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. Because so what that means is with addition and with multiplication, regardless of where you put the parentheses, as long as it's addition and multiplication, you'll be the same. And that's what's called the associative property. I always think of parentheses. So here, just use the associative property complete. So what they want you to do here is they want you to recognize that over here you can do 7 plus 8 plus 9. So that would be the associative. So here, 8 and 9 are associating, quote unquote, and on this side, 7 and 8 are associating. So here, again, they want you to just move the parentheses around. And we can check both of these if you want. So 8 plus 9 is 17. Sorry, that's not a 17. Plus 7 is going to be a 24. And then here you get 15 plus 9, which is also 24. So that's correct. And then here I just moved it. So here, remember, we're going to do parentheses first, which is 12. So 2 times 12 is going to be 24. And then on this side, we get 6 times 4, which is also 24. So we did it right. So that's another way you can do it. You can kind of check yourself just to make sure you're doing it. So I'll give you, what I would do now is I would just pause the video and see if you can give these a shot. I'll give you a couple seconds to work on this one. Okay, so what they wanted you to do is they wanted you to use the associative property. So I think for the first one, I think this does it for me. Yep. So here, you'll see that the 2 and the 8 are associating, quote unquote, but here the -5 and the 2 are now associating. So hopefully that makes sense. That's what it's trying to get you to say. And then here, the -8 and the -3 associating, and then here is the 10 and the -8, and that's associating. Now be careful here, just as a side note, I don't know if you guys remember, when you multiply two negative numbers together, that becomes a positive. So that's going to be a positive 24, which is going to give you 240. Here, although you're multiplying a positive and negative, this gives you -80, but when you times that by the -3, then that's where you get your positive 240. So hopefully that makes sense. This is where you can get yourself in trouble. Just a heads up. So this says distinguish between properties. So this says, is that an example of the commutative or the associative property? So just take a second. Okay, so this is where Matt can get you in trouble, because I said, hey, parentheses has to be associative, right? But here, you'll notice that the 2 and the 4 are associating, and here, that the 4 and the 2 are associating, it's actually the same number, just switched, if that makes sense. So that's just where it gets a little weird. So this one is actually the commutative property. It looks like it's the associative property, but the only way this would have been the associative property is if this, instead of being with 4 and 2, if this would have switched to like 2 and 6. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Okay, this is just something that I use all the time, and this, what's neat is this is kind of like an application of the associative property. So I'm going to rewrite these numbers differently, and I'll show you why here in a second. So here, I'm going to associate those two, and I'm going to associate those two. And the reason why I can do that is, well, if you take 43 plus 7, you'll get 50. So 43 plus 17 is going to give you 60. And in my mind, that's easier to go, if that makes sense. Instead of going to 43 plus 26, which is 79, and then trying to add 17, it just gets confusing. So here again, the 26 plus the 25, I think, is going to give you 50 plus 6, and then I have 60 plus 50, which is 110, plus 6 is going to be 116. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Secondly, down here, I'm going to move the 2. And what that's going to do is, what is 1/2 times 2? Well, I'm just thinking about a circle. I have this half and I had this half. I think that's just 1, right? So then I have 1 times 67, and what's 1 times 67? 67. Can I figure out what half of 67 is and then multiply it by 2? For sure. Is that the quickest and easiest way? Definitely not. So that's just a quick way to kind of figure out. It's like a shortcut to kind of get you there. All right, the next property we're going to talk about, I think we only have 2 more properties, is the identity property. So this one just means, like, what can you add or multiply that doesn't change it? And what I mean by that is, if you take any number, let's say 5, and if you add 0 to it, that number will again be 5. So the identity property of addition is going to be 0. Where the same thing, if this A is a 5, and this 5 times 1 is also 5. So so addition identity is 0. Multiplication identity is 1. Because if you take any number, I don't know, 35, and you times it by 1, it'll always be 35. If you take that same number, 35, and if you add 0 to it, it'll always be 35. So the identity property is going to be the idea of 0 for addition, multiplication is 1. So here it says use the identity property to complete a statement. So what can I put in here to make this equal to 3? I think I'd put in a 0, and then here I'm going to put in a 1. So pretty straightforward there. This would be yours, so go ahead and take a second to work on this one. Okay, so hopefully you saw up here. I think it gives me the answer, maybe not. Yeah, so you're going to plug in a 0 there, you're going to plug in a 1 there. Perfect. Okay, the last property is what's called the inverse property. And so we kind of talked about this last class when we talked about the additive inverses. And I think we know that the additive inverses, the thing that we talked about was just the opposite, right? So if I had a 3 here, the additive inverse would be a -3, because when I do 3 plus 3, that gives me 0. So we kind of already talked about this at inverse idea in the addition. Where it gets a little tricky is multiplication. So here, if I do 5 times 1/5, remember this 5 is technically over 1, And when we multiply fractions, we multiply straight across, so we get 5 over 5, which is equal to 1. So basically, that's what the multiplication inverse is. So if you have any number, the inverse is going to be 1 over that number. Now, the interesting thing is if you start with a fraction, does anyone know what the inverse is going to be? Well, it's actually going to be 2 over 1, also known as just 2. So hopefully that wasn't a little tricky or too confusing, but so here, what do I have to add to negative 2 to give me 0? I think that's going to be a positive 2. And then here, be careful, I want it to be a positive 1. But I think if I do negative 1/3 times negative 3, remember I talked about earlier, a negative times a negative will give you that positive, and I think we're good to go. So go ahead and take a second to try this one. We're almost done, I promise. So hopefully you guys got it. Negative 6 for that one, negative 9 for that one. And then this is the last property we're going to talk about. This is the distributive property. So there's two ways you can do the distributive property. So because here, so if I have, again, let's throw in some numbers because it's easier for me to understand. What this distributive property says, this one that's written out, is that you're going to distribute that to there. So you're going to do 2 times 3, which is 6. And then you're going to do 2 times 4, which is 8, and you're going to get 14, okay? Another way you could do it, because we can just use order of operations, is we could do this part first. Oh, sorry, this is 14. We could do this part first, which is 7, right? And 2 times 7 is also 14. So really, either way you can do it. Now, where you run into problems is this way, you know, I would say, sure, we can do that. So we get 12 plus 28, and I think that's what, 40? Where you can run into problems is like here. So, excuse me. So we could combine these because they're called like terms, but down here we can't, if that makes sense. So we're going to have to distribute these. So go ahead and give that, pause the video, give it a shot, and I promise we're almost done. I think one of you guys just texted me. Maybe not. Okay. Perfect. So hopefully when you, I think it does it for me. Maybe. Yeah. Oh, geez, it had fancy arrows. There you go. So you should get 10 minus 15. Remember, distribute it to the second one. That's where probably the biggest mistake is. A lot of people will distribute to the first, but not to the second. And then that should be the last one. Now be careful when you subtract a negative. I don't know if they're going to do it here or not, but yeah, it becomes a positive.